So good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And resuming after a break, last 2-3 months. And this series, of course, is personally for me very fascinating because every time I reconnect to a certain story, there's some new layer that opens up, and it's always about saying, oh my God, I didn't see this part of it before. So, and it feels particularly relevant at this point in time in our history where there's so much political upheaval and social upheaval going on, and it feels like it's a good time to reconnect with mythology in a manner that we should, and not in a historical sense, but in a purely philosophical and mythological sense. So, so far we've looked at six different kinds of myths from across the world. We started off with the first couple of stories based on the Mahabharata and Arjuna's story, and then we went to Prometheus and Psyche from the Greek literature, came back to Karna, and then Vibhishan, which is Ramayana. We're going back further west to the Middle East today and looking at Osiris. And that's one of the ways in which Osiris is depicted. And with Egyptian mythology, the fascinating part for me is layers and layers and layers of symbolism, and the symbolism runs in terms of their clothes, in terms of how they are depicted, in terms of the story itself, in terms of the way it gets acted out, and the incidents that happen are also symbolical in themselves. So Egyptian myth in general, if I have to use a very simplistic explanation in terms of the structure, the structure is starts and ends with Ra, which is the mythical sun god, right? And when they say sun, they don't necessarily mean sun as in our solar sun. What they mean is the holder of dharma, the holder of the central law for the entire universe, not just our solar system, but the entire universe, right? So that design principle of the universe, which is representative of divine will, is what is termed as Ra. And sometimes, yes, Ra is represented as a physical sun, sometimes it has other different representations, but usually the concept of Ra is not embodied. You wouldn't, while Ra is often referred to, it's not a personified representation. Ra is something that everyone, all of humanity and all of mythology works towards. Like the idea is to go back to Ra. The idea is to go back and merge with the divine will. And therefore, if you look at even the way the pyramids are constructed, at the bottom of the pyramids, at least the Great Pyramid, there is the upward pyramid, and there is also a downward thing where once you go down, it hits, or it used to hit the river Nile. Now it's dry, but it used to hit the stream, and once a person was dead, the body used to be put on a boat and then set sail towards Ra, which is a mythical sun. So it sets sail in the direction of the physical sun, but the intention is to go towards Ra. So the personification usually begins at the second layer, where Ra gets personified and physically embodied through deities that are ascribed to different elements, right? So you have Thoth, you have Hathor, which is in a way like the divine feminine and the divine masculine. A close analogy would be the Shiva and the Shakti in Indian myth, right? So that's Thoth and Hathor. And then you have the god of air and the god of moisture, which is Shu and Tefnut, right? And so largely, if you look at it, most of it is elemental in nature, in that we're talking about life forms or life forces as we know it on this planet, which includes the planet, the air, the moisture, the fire, all of that gets represented as deities that enable life as we know it. And amongst those, the myth so goes that Shu, the god of air, has progeny, and Shu gives birth to Geb, which is the earth god, and the sky, or what is called as Nut. Right? And so Geb and Nut is where polarization begins in the Egyptian myth. Right? Polarization in the sense duality starts. Till that point in time, it's still unity consciousness, and then duality begins when there is bifurcation. In the Indian myth, for example, the bifurcation happens through the manifest and the unmanifest, the masculine and the feminine principle, right? Shiva and Shakti. And in this case, it's the earth and the sky, what is accessible to us in the physical form, and the sky, which is the aspiration, which is the non-physical form. Right. So there's Geb and Nut. And then, of course, Geb and Nut together have 4 children, and it's interesting that they talk of these 4 as siblings, but the idea, often in Egyptian mythology and even ancient history, kings and queens often would refer to each other as brothers and sisters. Right? And the idea is not so much about talking about brothers and sisters in the incestuous sense of the term. We're talking about brothers and sisters in the philosophical sense that both are on the same path, and therefore a sense of fraternity about everyone moving towards Ra, everyone aspiring to move back towards unity. And in that sense, brothers and sisters in principle, that everyone's walking the same path. So from the earth and the sky, you have these 4 characters that emerge. Isis, that emerges as the embodied mother goddess, right? And then you have Osiris, that's her consort. You have Nephthys, which is the polarity of Isis, which is the funerary goddess. So Isis often is representative of life, and Nephthys is representative of death. So again, the polarity continues there. And Seth, who's the brother of Osiris, is usually depicted as the storm god, the god of bad weather. Right? So Osiris is someone who's the settled masculine, who's the provider, who's the nurturer, who makes life happen, and Seth is someone that destroys life as we know it. And the myth goes that Isis and Osiris are partners, and so are their twins, Nephthys and Seth. And Isis and Osiris together happen to birth Horus. And if you look at later mythology, Hathor comes back as the partner for Horus. So the unembodied mother goddess comes down here in a personified form as the partner of Horus. And there is Anubis, who's usually represented as the god of the dead. So again, life and death, the polarization continues. So if we look at the myth in general, it's obviously prehistory, so we're not talking pharaohs and the later part of it, we're talking of before that. And Osiris is there in the scheme of things, where he's descended from unity, descended from Geb and Nut, the union of the earth and the sky. So the story of Osiris is that Isis and Osiris are benevolent king and queen, and they rule their kingdom really well. And his brother Seth is extremely jealous of the popularity of Osiris, the fact that everyone seems to appreciate Osiris, everyone thinks of him as a great king, whereas Seth is not regarded as well. And that jealousy continues for a long time, and the myth speaks about several incidents where the two clash. And in most narratives, and there are different versions of the story, but in most narratives, at some point in time, Seth becomes extremely jealous of Osiris and decides to go about killing Osiris. And in most cases, the attribution is to jealousy. There are some myths that have variants around how Osiris provokes Seth, but in most of them, it's about Seth being not okay about the popularity of Osiris. And again, it is there are several versions of how the death happens. The most popular narrative is around how Seth initially tries to kill Osiris and it doesn't work because he springs back to life, till a point in time where he actually cuts the body into 14 different pieces such that they can't be rejoined. Right? So he wants to make sure that Osiris is really dead, and the body parts are flung into different parts of the Nile so that the river takes them in different directions. However, what happens in the process is Isis obviously does not accept this fate of Osiris, and it's like, again, a close analogy that we find in the Indian myth is the story of Savitri, who goes back to reclaim the husband from the dead. A similar story occurs here where Isis says, I'm not okay with my partner, the feminine not being okay with the masculine being dead, and therefore she goes out and seeks to revive the masculine. And she manages to find, with the help of several helpers, she manages to find pieces of the masculine and gets them assembled together. The only part, again, most narratives talk of it, the only part that is not found is the genitals of Osiris, which apparently are eaten by a catfish in the Nile. And the myth continues to an extent where even today Egyptians don't eat catfish, which is usually otherwise a popular thing to eat in the rest of the world. And so she manages to reassemble the body and fashions a new set of genitals, and she assumes the shape of a bird so that she can consummate with dead Osiris, and in the process Horus is conceived, their son is conceived. Now there's of course several layers of symbolism here as well. One is, if you look at how Joseph Campbell describes the hero's journey, that each of us go into a journey throughout our life to discover parts of us that are destroyed sometimes, right? So Isis, for example, as the feminine, as the woman, goes out and seeks to reassemble the parts of her own masculinity which are destroyed by the world, because the world does not allow a woman to access certain faculties, right? So for example, in a modern context, if we have to reinterpret that, the fact that women have to go out and journey to reclaim masculine aspects of themselves, particularly in societies where they may be told that you cannot be educated, or you cannot work, or you cannot wear certain things, or you cannot do what you want. The suppression leads to that quest of going out and saying, I'm going to go reclaim certain parts of me, reclaim certain parts of myself that can lead to wholeness and to freedom. So that there is a fight to go out and reclaim education, there's a fight to go out and reclaim the right to wear what you want, the right to get a partner of your choice, and so on. So each of these parts get reclaimed slowly, and they are put together till there is union, till there is wholeness. Right? And similarly for Osiris, the journey is different, where in his case the journey is from the outward to the inward, where the man is not really bound by social laws as much, but jealousy kills him. It's an inward journey for the man, it's an outward journey for the woman, right? So Osiris, while he enjoys all the popularity and joy of being a king, has not dealt with the inner journey of reconciling with his brother, and therefore the outward realm is shattered so that he can go within and look at what he needs to reclaim from within himself. And both of them in a way come back into wholeness from their brokenness, and through that union, through the wholeness that emerges with the both of them coming together, Horus is born. Horus is again represented in different ways, usually represented as a falcon in Egyptian myths. If you look at the picture, is represented as the bird falcon. And so yeah, that's overall the story. We can go into, of course, multiple deeper layers of it, but that will be a 2-day talk, so I'm going to stop here in terms of the story. But one of the ways in which it can be interpreted is looking at elements of each of those characters. If you look at the land in which the story of Osiris is set, which is Egypt, right? Traditionally dry land which is only fertile because the Nile flows through it, right? And again, the Nile does not hit all parts of the Egypt, all parts of the country. It only hits certain parts of the country, and therefore the land close to the river is fertile, whereas the land that you go land that is further inland is not, and there is dry, arid desert. So Osiris as a representation of the king, and this goes for even pharaohs in later Egyptian mythology, that most kings are representative of the river, the flow of the river, and how the flow of the river sometimes, depending on certain seasons, is great and it's a furious flow. Sometimes it's just a little stream, sometimes it gets dry, and it represents also the cyclicity of the nature of kings, that sometimes they rule really well, the kingdom is wealthy and it's prosperous, and there are kings that don't do so well, and sometimes there are absolute dry spells. And the dry spells are also indicative of the spiritual connection at that point in time, in terms of are people aligned to their ethical axis, or do they give in to lesser values, or sometimes lesser drives, as the case may be. So if you look at Osiris as the river, the flow of the river, and Isis as the land that is permeated by the river, that's penetrated by the river, and therefore gets fertile, and there is life possible because you can grow things on fertile land. So if you look at the union of the river and the land next to it as the partnership of Isis and Osiris, Horus then represents the civilization that flourishes in the process. Now, if you look at the polarity of it, there is Seth, which is the dry, barren desert, which is not accessible to the river. It's far away from the river, and therefore there is not much life in that place. And Nephthys, as the polarity of Isis, is the margin. It's where the fertile land ends, dry land begins. And from this symbolic perspective, if you relook at the story seems to be about, one, cyclicity of nature itself, and two, also looking at our own inner processes. So if you look at the cyclicity of nature, it's about how Osiris, when the river flows well, Isis keeps expanding, right? And the jealousy of Seth is often about saying, someone's reclaiming my desert land, I am the desert, and someone's not allowing me to be desert because the desert is becoming fertile, right? And Nephthys, who's meant to hold the boundary, she is the in-between land between the desert and the fertile land. Nephthys keeps getting pushed inward towards the desert when the river flows very well, and therefore the desert tries to push back into the river, and the river starts to go thin. And one representation of the paths being cut off, Osiris being cut off, is also about attempts to therefore bifurcate the river, or sometimes dam up the river in a way that it's contained and tributaries flow off, so that the river does not flow in full stream. And what happens as a result of that? And then Isis has to get the river back again together so that life flows. Because if the river flows in too small a stream, you can't really sustain life because there isn't enough water. So if you look at this symbolism and through that relink to our life, and that's where I would want to end, the questions for us to connect through this myth is, what's the life force in us? What is Osiris in us? What seeks to flow? What is the energy or the contribution? It may be flowing through us as a profession sometimes, as a skill, as a talent, as knowledge, right? But the point is, a river needs to flow. If it just stays with us and we don't do anything about it, it's not nourishing anybody. The desert still remains a desert, and there is a water in a tank, but there's not much use there, right? So the idea is, how does the Osiris flow in us? How do we engage with our... Yeah, it is. Yeah, and that's true for every myth, right? The idea of the myth is, can we become the myth? So when we speak of Arjun, for example, it's about, can we become Arjun? Right? Similarly, how do we become the myth in terms of enabling the flow? Right? And so looking at what is the Osiris, what is the flow, what is it that we have to offer to the world, and at the same time, what is the Seth in us? What is the jealous brother in us? What is the part of us that does not allow that flow? Right? And the Seth, in this particular myth, the attribution is jealousy, and it can have different attributions. Seth for me could be fear, that I don't want to do a certain thing because I'm afraid what will the world say. It could be lack of confidence. It could be buying into somebody else's fears, if not my own. So any limiting beliefs that come in the form of Seth, and that there's this constant battle between Osiris wanting to flow and Seth not allowing it to flow. And in the process, we make decisions, and the decisions are sometimes like how Seth hacks Osiris into pieces. We hack our own skills into pieces in the form of compromise to say, okay, I will not choose to do this which I really want to do, but I will do these two other small things, right? Which may not necessarily give me any satisfaction, but I'm trying to find an outlet there. Right?
Compromise.
Yeah, compromise, but in the process, the river is not flowing as a river. It's flowing as a tiny stream, and therefore, to utilize its potential, to really create the fertility that we can create. Yeah, we block ourselves, and it's a constant battle between Osiris and Seth within us. And therefore the question is about, how does the inner feminine, how does Isis respond? Does she make the effort to go back and reclaim Osiris? Does she make the effort to say, I will fight the world because what I have to offer, what I am is worth it, and therefore I will bring back everything that is hacked together. I will bring back all the compromised parts of me and put it together and get it to work, right? I will present all of myself to the world. And in the process, Nephthys, of course, is constantly getting challenged. We are pushing our own boundaries in terms of what more can we be, getting outside of our own comfort zone in the process. So as much as it's a story told outside, it's also a constant myth that we live within us, and it's fascinating how it talks of something that is so universal, something that is representative of pretty much every human that lives, in terms of how each of these parts live in us and how the battle constantly goes on, much like the battle of Kurukshetra constantly goes on. There's this battle that constantly goes on as well. And that's where I leave it today, the beauty of the fact that the myth is in us. Yeah, and it continues. Seth still continues to kill, and Isis still continues to integrate. And yeah, we live that day in and day out. So that's that for today. Thank you.